Before we talk about the sky over Nuremberg, we need to talk about fear. Because in 1561, fear shaped the way people understood the world. This wasn't like modern day Germany with science, weather reports, satellites, and astronomy apps. This was the Holy Roman Empire, a deeply religious world where people believed God communicated through signs in nature. And honestly, the sky kind of terrified people. A blood-red moon wasn't just a moon, a comet wasn't just a comet, an eclipse wasn't just astronomy. These things were often interpreted as warnings, like, you know, for example, divine punishment, the end times, war, the plague, even, or judgment from heaven itself. And the timing matters. Europe during the mid 1500s was unstable. Religious tensions were exploding after the Protestant Reformation. Catholics and Protestants were divided. Conflict and paranoia spreaded everywhere. People genuinely believed the apocalypse could happen within their lifetime. So imagine living in that environment. You wake up before sunrise in April of 1561. The streets are cold. Most homes are still dark. Church bells echo through the city, there's fog hanging over rooftops, and then suddenly, people begin staring upward because something impossible is happening above the sun. That's the psychological world the witnesses were living in. Which is very important because whether the event was natural or not, the people experience it believed they may have been witnessing a message from heaven, or something far worse. The event became so disturbing that a local printer and publisher named, correct me if I'm wrong, Hans Glaser created a broadsheet documenting what witnesses claimed to have seen that same day. Think of it as like an early newspaper mixed with religious commentary. The report wasn't neutral either. At the end of the broadsheet, Glaser basically warns people that humanity should repent and turn back to God after witnessing such a terrifying sign in heavens, which tells you exactly how seriously people took this event. This wasn't entertainment. To them, this was real and possibly divine. According to the report, the phenomenon began at dawn of April 14th, 1561, over the city of Nuremberg. The sun had just started rising. I think this was if I'm not mistaken, it was at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. I don't know. It was usually around the time. You all know that moment where let's say for example you stay up and it's 5:30, almost to 6, and the sun starts to kind of peek through, and when the sun starts rising, it's a very pretty scenery, especially when you go to the beach and you see the sun rising. Think of it as something like that. And around it, strange forms began appearing in the sky. According to witnesses, they described glowing balls, blood red crosses, crescents, tubes of cylinders, and a dark spear-like object. The woodcut illustration made afterward shows dozens of shapes scattered around the sun almost chaotically. But what disturbed witnesses most wasn't just the appearance of the objects, it was the movement. The report claims the objects began moving back and forth violently. Some appeared to chase one another, others collided, some spun, and according to the text, the shapes seemed to engage in what people described as a literal battle in the sky. Now remember, these weren't modern aircraft descriptions. The people of 1561 used the language they understood. So when they described the crosses, spears, and tubes, they may have simply been trying to explain unfamiliar shapes using familiar objects from the daily life and religion. One of the strangest details in the account involves the cylindrical objects. Witnesses claim that some long tube-like forms appear to release smaller glowing spheres, into the sky. That detail alone is one reason modern UFO researchers became obsessed with this case centuries later. I think some people still talk about it today. I know at one point later this past weekend or week, I had saw it all over my TikTok page, and I thought, you know what, maybe I should really get into some research to talk about this as well. Because it almost sounds mechanical, you know what I mean? Larger objects deploying smaller ones. Then came the part that truly unsettled people, which was in the report. Many of the objects eventually began supposedly falling from the sky. Not gently, but violently. The wording describes them as falling to the earth as if burning. That was written. Witnesses claim smoke appeared afterward. Some accounts interpret that this smoke had trails following the descending objects. Others, interpret it as clouds or haze forming afterward. And then came the final object. A massive dark shape described almost like a black spear or giant arrows stretching across the sky. The imagery is eerie even today, especially when you look it up. I'm going to put it up on the screen so you guys can also see what they actually saw that same day. Because that was drawn. That's what the artist did. A bright sunrise filled with glowing moving forms, and then suddenly a huge dark object looming overhead. The report says after this appeared, the phenomenon eventually faded. The sky returned to normal, but the emotional impact remained because people weren't just confused. They were literally terrified. And honestly, I think that fear is very important. Because even now, nearly 500 years later, when people read the original account, it still feels unsettling. Not because we know exactly what happened, but because we don't. We weren't alive during that time. My question is, what actually happened above Nuremberg that morning? The truth is, nobody really knows for certain. But over the centuries, several theories have emerged. And depending on which one you believe, the story becomes either a misunderstood natural event, a case of mass fear and symbolism, or one of the strangest sky sightings in recorded history. This is the explanation most historians and scientists support. They believe the event was likely caused by an atmospheric optic. Now that sounds boring at first, until you actually see what atmospheric optics can do. Under certain conditions, especially during cold mornings, sunlight passes through the ice crystals suspended high in the atmosphere. When that happens, the sky can produce halos, glowing arcs, floating lights, light pillars, crosses, and bright spots called sundogs. I'm gonna put up a picture of what that looks like so you guys can see by what they mean by that, which are things that we see kind of like in our normal day, like when you take pictures of the sun or like when the sky looks pretty. And like these formations can move as clouds shift. Some become brighter, others fade. Some appear red or orange depending on the sunrise's angle. Now imagine seeing all of that in 1561 without scientific knowledge. You'd probably think the sky itself was like breaking apart. The battle could have been shifting light formations. The falling objects that they claim to have seen may have been lights fading beneath the clouds or the horizon. The smoke may have been thin cloud streaks illuminated by the rising sun. Even the giant black spear they saw literally could have been a cloud shadow, a dark atmospheric band, or a visual distortion caused by intense sunlight. And honestly, this explanation probably makes the most sense scientifically, but there are still details that feel strange, which leads into the second theory. One thing humans are incredibly good at is turning uncertainty into narrative, especially during fear. Picture dozens of people gathering outside at sunrise, staring into a strange sky. Nobody understands what they're seeing. And then someone says, "Hey, those lights are moving." And then another person says, "Oh my god, they're fighting." Another sees a cross, another sees fire. Very quickly, the event transforms into a shared story. And once fear enters the picture, details grow larger and more dramatic. That doesn't mean witnesses lied. It just means human memory and interpretation are emotional, especially in moments of panic. And in the 1500s, people already believed heaven could send warnings through the sky. So the event naturally became interpreted as a supernatural sign. Even the language of the broadsheet reflects this. The report doesn't just describe the event, it moralizes it. At the end, people are urged to repent and fear God, which suggests the phenomenon was immediately framed spiritually and rather than scientifically. So, I want to get more into my third theory that I have here. I feel this is the one that people are genuinely most interested in, even I am. What if the witnesses actually saw something anomalous? Not weather, not symbolism, something genuinely unexplained. Now, listen, I'm somebody who believes in the supernatural, UFOs and all of that stuff, even when it comes to like phenomenons that revolve around, the atmosphere. Modern UFO researchers became fascinated with this case because certain details sound surprisingly modern. Objects maneuvering intelligently, formations interacting, cylinders releasing smaller objects, smoke trails, and silent movement in the sky. Mind you, this was happening in quiet, like in silence. This was happening in silence. And it was, some people even called it the quote unquote, the first recorded UFO battle. Now, personally, I don't think there's enough evidence to confidently say extraterrestrials were flying over Germany in 1561, but I do think it's fair to say the event clearly disturbed witnesses enough that it remained part of historical discussions for centuries. And I think what makes it creepy isn't necessarily aliens, it's ambiguity. The fact that no explanations completely erases the weirdness, because even if this was entirely natural, it must have looked absolutely fucking terrifying. So, I feel like this still haunts people. I mean, who knows? Maybe there's even people whose ancestors could have been alive, and stories like that were passed down to generations after generation. I think the reason people still talk about the Nuremberg phenomenon nearly 500 years later is because it taps into one of humanity's oldest fears, the fear of the sky becoming unfamiliar. There's something deeply primal about that. The sky is supposed to feel constant, safe, predictable, so when people suddenly look upward and see something they cannot explain, it literally shakes them emotionally. And that fear exists in every generation. In 1561, they interpreted it through religion. Today, people interpret it through extraterrestrials, simulations, interdimensional theories, or government conspiracies. But the emotional reaction stays the same. Back to what I said: fear, wonder, and confusion. I feel like maybe that's why the story survived. Because no matter how advanced humanity becomes, the unknown above us still terrifies us, especially when witnesses describe it as silent, glowing, impossible, and hanging directly over the rising sun. And honestly, if something like that happened tomorrow morning, most of us would probably panic and think the world is ending. What really happened over Nuremberg on April 14, 1561? Was it simply a rare atmospheric phenomenon misunderstood by terrified witnesses? A sunrise distorted by ice crystals and fear? Or did the people of Nuremberg witness something they generally could not explain? That's part of this story that continues to survive nearly 5 centuries later, because no matter how many theories exist, none of them fully erase the image left behind: a sky filled with glowing objects, violent movement, smoke, and a giant black shape looming above the city at dawn. Maybe that's probably why I also feel like this event still feels unsettling today. Not because we know what happened, but it's truly because we don't. We didn't get to live that. We didn't get to experience it. History is filled with so many mysteries that slowly fade over time. But every once in a while, a story remains alive because it touches something deeper: our fear of the unknown, the idea of realizing how fragile our sense of certainty really is. Like, let's be real. If we really put into perspective, and it's like I said, if something genuinely were to happen that was very impossible and something appeared in the sky literally the next day, how would we literally explain that? So now I want to ask you, if you had been standing in the Nuremberg that morning in 1561, looking up at glowing objects circling the rising sun, what do you think you would have believed? A warning from God? A natural phenomenon? Or something humanity still doesn't understand to this day? This was a short podcast episode, and I hope you guys really enjoyed it. I will be doing more things like this in the future. Could be crime stories or even the supernatural, which I feel like I do want to explore more of. So if you enjoyed this, please give it a like. Tell me your thoughts. and I'll see you in the next one.